Something has taken an interest in our most sensitive nuclear facilities. A silver entity with glowing eyes that defies the laws of physics. A witness paralyzed by beams of light. The ability to walk through solid barriers as if they don't exist. This episode will take you through the terrifying case of Ken Edwards and the mysterious Silver Man. An encounter that may have cost him his life. I'm Josh D'Annunzio, this is What Lurks Beneath, and you won't want to miss this one. On the night of March 17th of 1978, a 39-year-old service engineer named Ken Edwards was driving his van through an abandoned industrial district in Warrington, England. It was around 11:30 p.m., and Ken was simply exhausted. He just finished attending a union meeting in Greater Manchester, and he was now making the final leg of his journey home. At this time of the night, the roads were practically empty, which Ken greatly appreciated. It allowed his mind to wander while he thought through everything they discussed at the meeting. And pretty soon, he came up on the sprawling Risley Atomic Energy Complex. As Ken steered his van past the property, his headlights swept across something strange moving on an embankment next to the facility. Initially, he was pretty sure that it was just a man climbing down the slope, maybe a worker finishing his late shift. But Ken noticed that something about the movement was just off. It wasn't fluid or comfortable like a normal person would walk. Well, Ken's curiosity got the better of him, so he pulled his van over to the side of the road, coming to a stop about 50 feet away from the figure. Ken was not the kind of person who believed in the supernatural or even the paranormal. All of his colleagues always described him as very straight-laced, practical, very level-headed, the type. And that was a good thing. In his line of work as a service engineer, he dealt with real-world problems that had real, physical, tangible solutions. However, what he saw on this night ended up shattering his understanding of reality and would change the course of his life. As Ken peers through his windshield, this figure comes into clearer view, and he could see that it's around 7 feet tall. And it seems to either have silvery skin or, maybe it's wearing this metallic-like suit, and its posture is unnaturally stooped over. And he could see that the top half of its body is pitched forward in a very weird way, like it's kind of like the center of gravity is just too far for it to not fall over. But this thing doesn't fall over. Instead, it's moving with these bizarre stiff-legged movements, like it doesn't have any real knee joints. And as far as its face goes, it's black and round, but beyond that, he can't see much. In fact, the only features that he can make out are these two glowing eyes that kind of just pierce through the darkness. Now, I understand this all sounds like fiction, it sounds weird, but the strangest aspects of this thing were its arms and hands. The arms were very thin and they stuck straight out from its chest rather than from the shoulders. And so imagine kind of the way a Tyrannosaurus Rex's arms would be positioned. At the ends of these strange appendages were hands, but Ken couldn't see any fingers. And all this time, he's frozen in place and he's blown away by what he's seeing. And at this point, it's only about 30 or so feet away from his van and doesn't even seem to really have noticed him. At least not for long, because what happens next is wild. Two pencil-thin beams of white light zap out from this thing's eyes right in the direction of Ken's van, and as soon as they pass through the windshield and strike him in the chest, this very strange sensation comes over him. He starts getting drowsy and feeling very dizzy, and he would actually later on describe it like somebody with two enormous hands smashing down on him from the top. It just leaves him completely paralyzed. He can't move a muscle except for his eyes, and he certainly can't cry out. Not that there's anyone around to help him anyway. Well, as he's sitting there immobilized in his driver's seat, strange thoughts began flooding in his mind. And he was never really able to remember all of them, but they all felt like they weren't his thoughts. He felt like they had come from someone else. But one thought in particular kept repeating over and over. Is this something from outer space, and what does it want with me? Now, bear with me, guys. I understand this is really strange, but that's why you're here, right? So Ken is still paralyzed, and he's forced to watch helplessly as the silver entity moves closer. But for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to care about him anymore. It just keeps moving along with its awkward, stiff-legged gait toward a nearby fire station, and when it reaches the perimeter, he witnesses something that defies every law of physics. This thing somehow walks directly through a 10-foot-high barbed wire top security fence surrounding the fire station. And it did it like the fence wasn't even there. And so after passing through, it climbs a hill behind the fire station and vanishes past the borders of the property straight into the woods. As soon as this thing disappears, he felt this paralyzing force lift, and he can move again, but he's very disoriented and confused. And his first instinct was to get home as fast as possible. So he starts his van, drove away, and as you can imagine, his hands are violently shaking. He's so disturbed by what he had just witnessed and experienced. Fortunately, he's only about 5 or so minutes from home, but when he arrived, it was close to about 12:30, and he had no memory of the drive home or what had happened during that missing time. About an hour of time had just disappeared, and the next thing he knew, he was pulling into his driveway, feeling like he had just woken up from a nightmare. His wife, Barbara, was waiting for him because she was very worried about how late he was. And the second he walked through the door, she knew something had gone wrong. Instead of hugging her or explaining why he was so late, he just headed straight to the liquor cabinet, poured himself a large bourbon, and just downed it in one gulp. He then turns to his wife, very pale, and he whispers, "I've just seen a silver man." Now, needless to say, Barbara had no idea what this meant, but she could tell by how very visibly shaken her husband was that he saw something strange. She had never seen him like this before in all the years they'd been married. He was trembling, his eyes were wide with fear, and he just kept looking at his hands for some reason. And Barbara began to notice that they looked different. And in fact, upon closer inspection, Ken's hands looked a lot redder than they should have, almost like they had been sunburned. And not only that, but each finger had 3 dark marks running the entire length, marks that hadn't been there before tonight. The skin looked burned, but Ken wasn't really prone to sunburns or any skin conditions, so these mysterious marks would end up fading over the next 3 weeks. But they helped convince Barbara of the reality behind Ken's story. This wasn't the only physical evidence that they would discover in the coming days. Ken had a radio transceiver in his van that was now completely fried. An examination later carried out by technicians ended up revealing that the circuitry had been damaged by a massive power surge, which had burnt out the whole of the transmitting diode circuit and most of the capacitors. The technicians had never seen damage like this, and they couldn't explain what could have caused such a powerful surge. But Ken knew. He had seen those white beams of light coming straight out of the silver man's eyes. If anything could fry electronics, it would have been that. Well, after telling Barbara about his encounter that night, Ken made a decision that surprised even himself. He felt compelled to report the incident to the police. The main reason was because of where it took place. Whatever this thing had been, it appeared near one of the most sensitive nuclear facilities in Britain, and Ken felt a civic duty to report it. Even if it was just a person, they were in the middle of the Cold War, so Soviet sabotage was never out of the question. Despite how late it was and how tired they felt, Ken and Barbara got back in their car and drove to the police station at Padgate, which was less than 2 miles from their home. Now at the station, he told the story to the police officers, Roy Kirkpatrick and Rob Thompson. Now to his surprise, they didn't dismiss his story outright. I mean, sure, they were skeptical, but they also saw how very visibly shaken he was. And given the intruder's proximity to the nuclear facility, it was better to be safe than sorry. The experience warranted an investigation. Well, the atomic energy complex that Ken was driving past that night was actually quite significant to national security. After World War II, the Risley District became the headquarters for Britain's Department of Atomic Energy, or Dayton, which later evolved into the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority, or UKA. The UK was tasked with producing nuclear reactors and bolstering England's nuclear defense program. And in 1962, an Argonaut-class reactor, co-owned by Liverpool and Manchester universities, went online at the site. Now, this reactor was concrete shielded and used highly enriched uranium metal fuel for neutron activation experiments. Yeah, this whole district and this facility were highly sensitive and surrounded by tons of security. If somebody suspicious was around there with the ability to pass right through fences, law enforcement should know. After taking Ken's statement, officers Kirkpatrick and Thompson decided to accompany him back to the scene of his encounter. And they weren't alone. A contingent of 20 baton-armed security guards joining them formed a substantial search party. What's particularly strange is that these guards, who were professionally trained and of course presumably skeptical by nature, showed no skepticism whatsoever when told of the sighting. They were so concerned that they refused to enter the forest where this thing had disappeared. But as you might imagine, the search of the area yielded no evidence, or even any tampering with the fence. But the investigators did find something strange on top of the embankment where Ken had first spotted the figure. An oval-shaped patch of flattened grass, like something had rested there or maybe had landed there. And next to this flattened area, they found a dead rabbit. The animal had no apparent injuries, it was just dead for no obvious reason. By the time Ken finally got home that night, it was after 4 a.m. You've probably experienced this yourself. Even though he was more exhausted than he'd ever been in his life, he just couldn't get to sleep. In fact, he would experience intense insomnia for days afterward, his mind just constantly replaying every second of the encounter. Interestingly, when he checked his watch the first thing the next day, he noticed that it had stopped at 11:45 p.m., which was around the exact time that he had been zapped by the Silverman. He later learned that even though he took it to several watch repair shops to have it fixed, it never worked. The hands always remained stuck at 11:45. Now, in the meantime, the police continued their investigation. This meant not only on-site work, but further interviews with Ken. The cops were just eager to get this case closed and call it a day. They kept interviewing him, trying to find a detail that could just explain it all. And at one point, they even went so far as to show Ken a man dressed in a silver fire retardant suit to see if that might explain what he had seen. And he just firmly stated how absurd this was, because it looked nothing at all like what he had encountered on the evening of March 17th. But as far as these things go, the police eventually just seemed to lose interest. One officer dismissively described it as just one of those odd incidents that happen from time to time. No matter how much he would have liked to have moved on with his life, he couldn't let it go. This had affected him deeply, and for some reason he felt drawn back. So on March 23rd, 1978 at midnight, just mere days after his initial encounter, he returned to the location with a UFO investigator from Leeds who had reached out after hearing about his experience. Now, this is where it continues to get stranger and stranger. And as soon as they both arrive at the site, he starts to notice a familiar sensation. It's that same feeling he had experienced during his encounter, this weird dizziness and intense pressure. And now, the investigator, noticing how uncomfortable Ken is, suggests that they need to separate. Maybe he thinks it's just related to this one particular spot. So, you go somewhere else while I stay here. Ken thinks that is a good idea, so he walks away, climbing to the top of the embankment, while the investigator searches the road below. Well, while alone at the top of the embankment, Ken can't believe his eyes, because from the corner of his vision, he spots movement, and it's the same Silverman he just saw a few nights ago, and it's just walking like it had before, although now it's heading away from where he's standing. And of course, he calls out for the investigator to join him, but by the time he reached Ken's position, the Silverman had gone. It had literally vanished. It's easy to imagine that Ken is making all this up, but remember, the radio was fried, his watch was broken, and he had those weird marks on his fingers. And on top of that, right after his second sighting, the investigator noticed that Ken genuinely seemed scared and physically shaken by what he claimed to have seen. As it turns out, his experiences did not end there. He tried to regain a normal life, but on April 2nd, 1978, at around 2 in the morning, Ken and his wife Barbara were driving back from Yorkshire when something unexpected happened. The route that they chose took them past the exact same spot where Ken had his first encounter. And as they approached the area, he started to get this overwhelming compulsion to stop the car. Barbara, of course, wanted nothing to do with it, but Ken won the argument, pulled over and got out of the car and stood there in the middle of the road at the location of the sighting. She watched in horror from inside the car as he just stood motionless in the road. And from what she could tell, he was again experiencing the same sensations that he had described during his previous visits. His face twisted into that same expression of fear and paralysis, and then, to Barbara's terror, Ken's legs buckled. He fell to his knees and was barely able to stay upright. When he returned to the car, he was pale and shaking, and he explained that he had briefly blacked out while on the road, and he made a solemn pledge never to travel that same way again. Well, for another 10 days, nothing else happens. Fast forward to April 12th. He's awakened in the middle of the night by this strange noise. It's like a deep electrical hum pulsating through their house. And he's thinking that this has to be a faulty appliance or something. So he gets up, he investigates, but he doesn't find anything. And he goes to open the window to see if the sound is coming from outside. And that's when the humming gets dramatically louder. Ken didn't know what it meant, but as it turned out, he wasn't the only one to have heard it. 2 other people in the area heard a similar hum that same night. And they also reported seeing a red, oval-shaped UFO in the sky on that same night. This UFO sighting wasn't exactly an isolated incident either. You had 4 young people who had reported seeing a cigar-shaped craft over the university research reactor on March 17th, which was the very same day as Ken's experience with the Silverman. And in the weeks leading up to it, at least 8 other UFO sightings were reported in the area. So something strange was definitely happening, and Ken had somehow gotten caught up in it. Eventually, UFO investigators Jenny Randles and Paul Wetnall became very interested in Ken's case, and they would conduct extensive research into his encounters. Now, during the investigation, they uncovered something intriguing. Supposedly, unusual experiments were being conducted in an Atomic Energy Authority building near the location of Ken's experiences. Naturally, the nature of these was classified, but their timing seemed to coincide with the dramatic increase in sightings in the area. Well, you guys know how the story goes by now. Pretty soon, his encounter was spread far and wide. It was in the local paper, the Warrington Guardian. I mean, it was just a lot of people knew about it. And soon, national newspapers picked the story up too. The Sunday People ran a headline that said, "Close encounter as Ken meets a monster." The Sunday Post went with "Silver giant beams light fantastic," while the News of the World opted for the more sensationalist "Ken and a flasher from outer space." This publicity, a lot of which quite frankly was making fun of him, had a profound impact. His home was soon under siege by reporters. You had amateur ufologists and curious visitors, and there were even people from UFO religions who showed up at his door to tell him that he had been chosen for a special mission. And on the other end of the spectrum, skeptics publicly accused Ken of lying or just being mentally ill. In Ken's defense, though, he never made any book or television deals. He never tried to capitalize on this experience. And the constant scrutiny and varied reactions from the public did take a toll on him and his wife. And eventually, they were both forced into hiding and even canceled vacation plans to escape the attention. What's really strange about Ken's case is the mysterious marks on his fingers, his stopped watch, and the damaged radio transceiver, all suggesting that something very real had happened to him. And Ken himself, described by everyone as a practical, no-nonsense kind of man, just seemed unlikely to have perpetuated a hoax or given into a overactive imagination. Now, one of the few possibilities left is that Ken had been the victim of a prank. There were universities nearby. I mean, young people with time on their hands are always up for some shenanigans. But Ken never thought this was the case. In fact, regarding the possibility of that, he simply said, "I wish they could tell me how they did it, how they blew up my radio and walked through a fence, some stunt." Sadly, the most disturbing aspect had yet to unfold. You see, within a year of his sighting, he began experiencing serious health problems. He started complaining about a loss of energy and severe stomach pains. At first, doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him, but eventually, he was diagnosed with kidney cancer. So he agreed to have surgery, but even still, his health continued to deteriorate. The cancer later appeared in his throat, suggesting that it had been metastasized despite the surgery. Ken's condition worsened rapidly, and within 5 years of his encounter with the Silverman, he was dead. Now, it's impossible to prove whether or not Ken's cancer was related to his encounter, but the timing was definitely suspicious. Ken had been in great health before his encounter on March 17th, 1978, so the fact that he ended up developing a rare and aggressive form of cancer so soon after raises questions about whether or not he was exposed to some form of energy that might have caused it. And he's also not alone, because many other ufologists and people who have undercover or secret knowledge of UFOs or aliens, who have an experience or information they want to share, also seem to die under mysterious circumstances, or they too develop a very rare and aggressive cancer. So is there a connection there? Who knows? But Ken Edwards' story remains one of the most intriguing and well-documented close encounter cases in British history. But it does make us wonder that if this was somehow related to those unusual experiments being conducted at the nearby nuclear facility, it suggests a disturbing cover-up of something that had lethal consequences for at least one ordinary man. Unfortunately, the identity of this strange silver man, whether it be a UFO, interdimensional being, a person in a suit, it all remains a mystery. And because you guys all made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment below, "Hi ho silver," so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy content like this, where we deep dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. And as always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.